When Kang Seo-Jin caught his wife with his greatest rival, everyone expected a bloodbath. In the cold neon lights of the penthouse, the rival smirked. His wife, Seo-Rin, waited for the explosion that would end her life. But instead, the most feared boss in Seoul did the unthinkable. He didn't pull a trigger. He didn't say a word. He simply turned around and walked away. The underworld laughed, calling him weak. The rivals celebrated his victory, and his wife was left in a silence more terrifying than a bullet. What they didn't realize was that when a monster stops growling, it's because he's already finished the hunt. The heavy oak doors of the hotel suite didn't creak. They glided open with a silence that was far more menacing than a crash. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of betrayal. Seo-Rin froze. The glass of champagne in her hand trembled, the golden bubbles catching the harsh light from the crystal chandelier. Beside her, Min Hyuk leaned back against the silk headboard, his silk shirt unbuttoned, a smirk playing on his lips that said he had been waiting for this exact moment. He didn't look like a man caught in a scandal. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prize. "You're early, Seo-Jin," Min Hyuk drawled, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I thought the board meeting would keep you tied up until midnight." Seo-Jin didn't answer immediately. He stood in the threshold, a silhouette of sharp angles and impeccable tailoring. The neon glow of the Seoul skyline bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, casting his shadow long across the plush carpet. He looked less like a husband and more like a statue carved from obsidian. Seo-Rin's breath hitched. She wanted to scream, to explain that the drink had tasted strange, that the room had started spinning the moment she entered, but her tongue felt like lead. Her eyes pleaded with him, searching for the familiar flash of possessive fire that usually defined the head of the Kang Syndicate. Instead, she found a void. Seo-Jin stepped into the room, his leather shoes clicking softly, a rhythmic funeral pace. He ignored Min Hyuk entirely. His gaze swept over Seo-Rin, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a ruined asset. He reached the side table, where a bottle of his favorite vintage sat chilling. Slowly, methodically, he poured a glass. "Seo-Jin, please," she whispered, the word breaking in her throat. He swirled the amber liquid, watching the legs of the wine coat the glass. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes devoid of the heat she had lived in for 3 years. In that moment, Seo-Rin realized that the man she feared wasn't the one who shouted or broke things. It was the man who looked at her and saw nothing at all. "The locks have already been changed," Seo-Jin said, his voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He took a single, elegant sip, then placed the glass down. Without a backward glance, without a single accusation or a hand raised in fury, he turned. The door closed behind him with a soft, final thud. He had walked away, leaving her in the hands of his enemy, and in that terrifying silence, Seo-Rin knew her world had just ended. The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the scent of expensive cologne and spilled wine. Seo-Rin stood frozen, her hand clutching the silk robe that felt like a shroud. Across from her, Min Hyuk lounged against the mahogany desk, a victor's smirk etched onto his face. He had expected blood. He had expected the legendary wrath of the Kang Syndicate to tear through the door with lead and fire. Instead, there was only Seo-Jin. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the hallway lights. He didn't look like a man who had just found his world in ruins. He looked like a god watching an anthill. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the room, lingering on the disarray of the bed for only a fraction of a second before settling on his wife's trembling form. "Seo-Jin, I can explain," she whispered, the words dying in her throat as she realized the futility of the lie. Min Hyuk let out a dry, mocking laugh. "Explanation's a bit late, don't you think, boss? The queen of the Kang family seems to prefer a different throne." Seo-Jin didn't blink. He stepped into the room, his movements fluid and terrifyingly calm. He didn't reach for the holster beneath his jacket. Instead, he reached for his left hand. With a slow, deliberate motion, he twisted the platinum band from his finger. The metal caught the dim light, a symbol of a 3-year empire built on what everyone thought was ironclad loyalty. He walked toward Min Hyuk. Seo-Rin flinched, expecting a strike, a shove, anything. But Seo-Jin simply stopped at the desk. He held the ring out. "It's a high-grade alloy," Seo-Jin said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that betrayed zero emotion. "Custom-made, just like the woman." Min Hyuk's smirk flickered. This wasn't the reaction he had spent months planning for. "What are you doing?" "You wanted what was mine," Seo-Jin replied, dropping the ring. It hit the mahogany with a sharp clink and rolled until it stopped against Min Hyuk's hand. "Now you have it. The debt, the drama, and the woman, she's your responsibility now." "Seo-Jin, stop," Seo-Rin cried, taking a step forward. "You can't just—" He turned his gaze to her then. It wasn't hatred she saw, it was a terrifying emptiness. It was as if she had ceased to exist to him the moment the ring touched the desk. "I don't keep broken things," he said simply. Without another word, without a backward glance at the wife who had been his only vulnerability, Seo-Jin turned. He walked out of the suite, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor in a steady, rhythmic pace. He didn't slam the door. He left it wide open, exposing them to the cold, judgmental air of the hallway. He had walked away, leaving behind the only thing he had ever loved, and in doing so, he had invited a darkness into the room that made Min Hyuk's victory feel like a funeral. The silence of the Kang mansion was louder than the screams Seo-Rin had expected. As she stood in the grand foyer, the marble floors that once felt like a foundation now felt like thin ice. The house staff, people who had bowed to her for 3 years, stood in a jagged line near the service entrance, their eyes fixed firmly on their shoes. "The master's instructions were precise," the head butler said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. He didn't look at her as he placed a single, small suitcase by the heavy oak doors. "You are to take only what you brought into this marriage. The jewelry, the seasonal wardrobe, the designer bags, they remain property of the Kang estate." Seo-Rin felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. She had brought nothing into this marriage but a naive hope that a contract could turn into a sanctuary. She looked down at her hands, still trembling, and realized she was still wearing the 5-carat diamond ring Seo-Jin had placed on her finger at the altar. With a sharp tug, she pulled it off. The metal was cold, leaving a pale, empty mark on her skin. She held it out, but the butler stepped back as if the gold were radioactive. "Place it on the table, madam," he whispered, the title sounding like a slur. "He doesn't want to receive anything directly from your hands." The rejection stung worse than a physical blow. Seo-Jin hadn't just walked away in the hotel, he had erased her. He was dismantling her existence with the same surgical precision he used to take down rival syndicates. As she gripped the handle of her lone suitcase, the front doors swung open. Waiting outside wasn't a sleek black sedan, but the humid, oppressive air of the Seoul streets. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of the locks engaging. Thud, 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 3 deadbolts sealing her out of the only world she knew. She walked down the long, winding driveway, her heels clicking rhythmically against the asphalt. By the time she reached the iron gates, the rain began to fall, a sudden, violent downpour that soaked through her thin silk blouse in seconds. Across the street, a black car sat idling. For a heartbeat, her heart soared, thinking Seo-Jin had changed his mind. But as the window rolled down, she saw the predatory smirk of Min Hyuk. "Left out in the cold, Seo-Rin?" the rival purred, his eyes scanning her disheveled state with dark satisfaction. "He really did the unthinkable. He didn't kill you, he made you a ghost, and ghosts have no one to protect them." Seo-Rin straightened her shoulders, ignoring the water streaming down her face. She realized then that her flaw wasn't just loving too much. It was believing that her safety depended on the shadow of a man. As she walked past the car and into the dark city, she knew the Ice King had stripped her of her crown. But in the shivering cold, she was finally starting to feel the fire of her own rage. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Min Hyuk's private office, mirroring the cold dread pooling in Seo-Rin's chest. She stood by the leather sofa, her hands trembling as she clutched the lapels of her coat, the only thing she had left after being cast out of the Kang mansion. "Seo-Jin walked away, Min Hyuk," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and lingering shock. He's gone. He didn't even fight for me. You said if we were together, we'd finally be free of him. Min Hyuk didn't look up from the glass of scotch he was swirling. The warm, golden light of the office caught the sharp edge of his smile, a smile that no longer reached his eyes. He let out a soft, dry chuckle that made the hair on Seo-Rin's neck stand up. Free, Min Hyuk finally looked at her, but the warmth she thought she'd found in him had vanished, replaced by a predatory gleam. Seo-Rin, you really are as naive as Seo-Jin's report suggested. He stood up, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate pace that felt like a hunter closing in on wounded prey. He stopped just inches away, but he didn't reach out to comfort her. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a jagged silkiness. I didn't want you because I loved you. I wanted you because you were the only thing Kang Seo-Jin actually kept for himself. You were a trophy, a high-stakes play to see if the Ice King had a breaking point. He reached out, not to caress her cheek, but to flick a strand of hair away from her face with clinical indifference. But it turns out, he doesn't. He handed you to me like a piece of worthless scrap metal. And do you know what we do with scrap, Seo-Rin? She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. You lied to me. Everything you said about a future together was a script, he interrupted, his face hardening into a mask of pure malice. And now that the lead actor has walked off the stage, the play is over. Without Seo-Jin's protection, you're not a queen, you're not even a pawn, you're just a liability. He turned his back on her, returning to his desk as if she were already invisible. Get out, Seo-Rin. The guards will see you to the street. I have no use for a woman whose husband doesn't even think she's worth a bullet. As the heavy mahogany doors creaked open behind her, Seo-Rin realized the horrific truth. Seo-Jin hadn't just walked away from a marriage. He had walked away from a trap, leaving her to realize that the man she thought was her savior was the very one who had orchestrated her ruin. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, and the silence of the city outside felt like a death sentence. The morning sun hit the marble floors of Han Seo-Rin's temporary hotel suite, but the warmth didn't reach her skin. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. The silence of the previous night, the way Seo-Jin had looked at her with those hollow, obsidian eyes before walking away, felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She needed a way out. If she could just transfer enough funds to disappear for a few weeks, she could find the evidence to prove she had been set up. She opened her private banking app, her breath hitching as she typed in the password. Access denied. She tried again, her heart hammering against her ribs. Error, account restricted. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She scrambled for her purse, pulling out a black titanium credit card, a supplementary card to the Kang Syndicate's main treasury. She rushed down to the lobby, ignoring the curious stares of the staff who had surely heard the whispers of the underboss's wife being caught in a scandal. I need a cash withdrawal. Maximum limit, she told the concierge, her voice tight. The man swiped the card. A second later, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to a chilling, distant pity. I'm sorry, Mrs. Kang. The transaction was declined by the primary account holder. In fact, he hesitated, looking at his screen. I've been instructed to inform you that your stay here is no longer covered. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises. Seo-Rin felt the floor tilt. Seo-Jin wasn't just walking away from the marriage, he was erasing her existence from his world. Every luxury, every safety net, every cent that bore the Kang name was vanishing in real time. She stepped out onto the busy Seoul sidewalk, the humid air thick with the smell of exhaust and street food. She pulled out her phone to call her mother, but the screen flashed a final, mocking notification. Service disconnected. Across the street, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows sat idling. She knew that car. It was Seo-Jin's security detail. They weren't there to protect her anymore. They were there to witness her fall. In his high-rise office, Kang Seo-Jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a tablet in his hand showing a map of Seo-Rin's location. One by one, he watched the icons for her assets turn gray. He didn't feel the triumph he expected. He only felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the unthinkable. He had stripped her of everything, not because he hated her, but because he needed to see who would pick her up once she was in the dirt. Only then would the true traitors show their hand. Seo-Rin stood on the corner, a designer bag on her arm and not a single one to her name, realizing for the first time that the man who never spoke had finally said everything. He had turned the entire city into her prison. The transition from silk sheets to the steam-choked air of a basement kitchen was a descent into a world Han Seo-Rin never knew existed. In the 3 weeks since Kang Seo-Jin had handed over his wedding ring and walked away in that deafening silence, the high society life of a mafia queen had been stripped away like a coat of paint. Her bank accounts were frozen with a single keystroke. Her penthouse access code had been changed before she even reached the lobby. Now, her hands, once manicured and soft, were red raw from the constant immersion in dishwater and the sting of industrial soap. The basement of the iron pot was a labyrinth of echoing metal and the rhythmic thud of cleavers. Seo-Rin spent 14 hours a day hunched over a sink, the heat from the industrial stoves pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The staff, immigrants, and runaways who didn't ask questions saw her only as a nobody with haunted eyes. To them, she was just another girl hiding from a debt or a bad man. They didn't know she was hiding from a ghost. Every time the swinging door to the dining room creaked open, her heart would lurch. She dreaded seeing the faces of those who used to bow to her, now looking down at her from the height of a menu. But worse than the fear of being seen was the constant, gnawing memory of Seo-Jin's back as he exited that hotel room. He hadn't just taken her status, he had taken her dignity by refusing to even acknowledge her betrayal. It was the ultimate psychological warfare. Table 4 extra kimchi, move it, new girl, the head chef barked, sliding a heavy ceramic bowl toward her. Seo-Rin wiped her brow with a damp sleeve, her breath coming in shallow hitches. As she reached for the bowl, she caught her reflection in a stainless steel pot. The woman staring back looked nothing like the wife of the Kang Syndicate head. Her hair was pulled back in a fraying tie, her face was pale, and her eyes were tired. But there was a new, sharp flicker of resilience in them. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being protected or controlled. She was surviving on her own terms, even if those terms were dictated by the grime of a kitchen floor. She lifted the tray, her muscles aching with a fatigue she had never earned in her former life. She was learning that silence could be a shield just as much as a weapon. As she moved toward the service window, she didn't realize that a black sedan was idling in the rainy alleyway just outside the basement vent, the darkened glass hiding a pair of eyes that had never stopped watching her. In the underworld, a nobody was the easiest person to kill, or the perfect person to transform. The smell of burnt oil and industrial-grade soap had become Seo-Rin's new reality. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now red and raw from scrubbing the grime of a third-rate kitchen in the outskirts of Seoul. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she kept her head down, fearful and yet strangely hopeful. Then it happened. The air in the cramped restaurant shifted. The loud chatter of the midday workers died into a suffocating hush. Seo-Rin didn't need to look up to know who had entered. She felt the temperature drop, felt that familiar, heavy aura of power that always preceded Kang Seo-Jin. She stood frozen behind the counter, a stained apron tied over her cheap clothes. Through the grease-fogged window of the kitchen pass, she watched him. He looked like a god of marble dropped into a wasteland. His charcoal suit was hand-tailored, his hair perfectly swept back, and his expression was as unreadable as a frozen lake. He wasn't alone. A line of black-clad men stood outside, turning the humble eatery into a fortress. Seo-Rin's heart hammered against her ribs so hard it was painful. This was the man who had handed his wedding ring to his rival. The man who had walked away from her without a single backward glance. Her breath hitched as he took a seat at a wobbly corner table, the very one she had scrubbed only minutes before. "Order," the cook barked, shoving a tray toward her. With trembling hands, Seo-Rin took the bowl of humble noodles. She walked toward his table, her vision blurring. She wanted to scream, to plead, and to ask him why he was here. Was this more punishment, or was he finally going to say something? As she reached the table, she set the bowl down. Her fingers brushed the wood near his hand. She waited for him to look up. She waited for the fire of his gaze, for the cold snap of his voice, for any sign that he recognized the woman who had shared his bed for 3 years. But Seo-Jin didn't look up. He was looking at a document on his phone, his thumbs scrolling with clinical precision. He picked up the wooden chopsticks and began to eat as if she were a ghost. To him, she wasn't a wife, a traitor, or even an enemy. She was simply the help. "Napkin," he said quietly, his voice smooth and terrifyingly indifferent. He didn't look at her face when he said it. He spoke to the air. Seo-Rin handed him the cheap paper napkin, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. He took it, his fingers never touching hers, his eyes never wavering from his screen. He finished his meal in 5 minutes, stood up, and placed a stack of bills on the table, enough to buy the entire restaurant. As he walked toward the door, his shoulder brushed hers. He didn't flinch. He didn't pause. He stepped out into the sunlight, and the black cars roared to life, leaving Seo-Rin standing in the middle of the room, invisible and utterly destroyed. The silence he left behind was louder than any goodbye. The dim lights of the VIP lounge at Club Inferno flickered like a dying pulse, casting long, jagged shadows across Min Hyuk's panicked face. He gripped his glass so hard his knuckles turned white, staring at the 3 enforcers from the Kang Syndicate who stood like stone statues before him. "The interest alone has tripled, Min Hyuk," the lead enforcer rasped, his voice a low vibration that made the ice in Min Hyuk's glass rattle. "Seo-Jin doesn't like to be kept waiting. He wants the debt settled by dawn, or he wants your head on a platter." Min Hyuk's eyes darted toward the corner of the room where Seo-Rin sat, draped in a coat that was far too thin for the Seoul winter. She looked like a ghost, pale, hollowed by the betrayal, but still carrying the regal elegance that had once made her the crown jewel of the underworld. She was his last card, the only thing he had left that belonged to the man he feared most. "I don't have the cash," Min Hyuk stammered, his voice cracking as he stood up and gestured toward her. "But I have something better, something your boss used to value above all else. Take her." Seo-Rin froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She looked at the man she had risked everything for, the man she thought offered a warmth her husband never could, and saw only a coward looking for an exit strategy. "Min Hyuk," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "Shut up, Rin," he snapped, not even looking at her. He turned back to the enforcers, his face twisting into a desperate, oily smile. Think about it. Returning his unfaithful wife to him, the humiliation, the leverage. She's worth more than the money. Take her as a down payment. Tell Seo-Jin she's his to do with as he pleases. The lead enforcer looked at Seo-Rin, his eyes scanning her with a cold, professional detachment that made her skin crawl. He took a step toward her, the heavy thud of his boots echoing against the marble floor. Seo-Rin felt a surge of cold fire in her chest. For years, she had endured Seo-Jin's icy silence, believing she was a burden he merely tolerated. But being traded like a piece of livestock by a man who claimed to love her was a different kind of death. She stood up, her dignity a fragile shield, and looked the enforcer in the eye. "He won't take me," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "He walked away for a reason. He doesn't want the trash you've gathered." "We'll let the boss decide what he wants," the enforcer replied. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "As for you, Min Hyuk, this buys you 24 hours. If Seo-Jin rejects the gift, we'll be back for your tongue." As she was dragged toward the exit, Seo-Rin looked back at Min Hyuk, who was already pouring himself another drink, his hands shaking with relief. She realized then that Seo-Jin's silence hadn't been her prison, it had been her protection. And now, she was being delivered back to the man who had walked away from her, not as a wife, but as a debt to be collected. The cold, clinical air of the private auction house felt like a shroud. Han Seo-Rin stood on the small, raised platform, her fingers trembling against the silk of a dress that no longer felt like hers. Across the room, Min Hyuk lounged in a velvet chair, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. He had stripped her of her dignity, her marriage, and now he was treating her like a line item in a bankruptcy filing to settle his mounting debts with the Kang Syndicate. "The assets are verified," a mediator spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. In exchange for the cancellation of the Westport debts, ownership of the Han estate and the personal guardianship of Han Seo-Rin will be transferred to no one, a voice interrupted. The heavy oak doors swung open, hitting the walls with a dull thud that silenced the room. Kang Seo-Jin stepped into the light. He didn't look like a man who had been betrayed. He looked like a god of war who had simply grown bored with the peace. He didn't look at Seo-Rin. He didn't even acknowledge her tear-stained face. Min Hyuk stiffened, his smirk faltering. Seo-Jin, I thought you walked away. You made it clear she was garbage to you now. Seo-Jin walked to the center of the room, pulling a fountain pen from his breast pocket with terrifying deliberation. I don't leave my garbage in other people's houses, Min Hyuk. It creates a mess. He signed the transfer papers without leaning over, his eyes locked on his rival. The debt is cleared, but let's be precise about the terms. I'm not taking back a wife. He finally turned his gaze toward Seo-Rin. His eyes were like shards of black glass, cold, sharp, and utterly hollow. I am purchasing a debt slave, he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. You thought you wanted freedom from my indifference, Seo-Rin. Freedom is expensive, and since you can't pay for it, you belong to the Syndicate now. Seo-Rin felt the breath leave her lungs. She had expected rage, perhaps even a hidden spark of the love they once shared, but this was worse. This was a business transaction. Get in the car, Seo-Jin commanded, already turning his back on her. Seo-Jin, wait, she started, reaching out a hand. He stopped, but didn't turn around. The tension in his shoulders was the only sign of the storm beneath the surface. You don't speak unless I give you the words, Seo-Rin. You lost the right to my name the night you stepped into his suite. Now, you're just something I bought back to ensure no one else can use what's mine. As he walked out, leaving her to follow him like a shamed shadow, Seo-Rin realized the unthinkable walk away wasn't an exit. It was the beginning of a cage she had built for herself, and the man she loved was now her warden. Seo-Jin sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, the moonlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kang headquarters casting his face in sharp, unforgiving angles. He didn't look up when the heavy double doors creaked open. He didn't need to. He knew the sound of Seo-Rin's footsteps, hesitant, light, yet carrying a weight of desperation that hadn't been there a month ago. I'm here, she whispered. The scent of her expensive perfume was gone, replaced by the faint, clinical smell of the dish soap from the kitchen where she'd been hiding. Seo-Jin finally looked up. His eyes were like dark glass, reflecting nothing. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the desk. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the silent room. Your father's debts have been bought. Your rival's protection has been revoked, Seo-Jin said, his voice a low, melodic threat. In the eyes of the law and the underworld, you are a liability, but to me, you are a debt that has yet to be settled. Seo-Rin's fingers trembled as she opened the folder. It wasn't a divorce settlement. It was an employment contract. Assistant, she asked, her voice cracking. You want me to take your calls, to organize your meetings after you left me to rot. I want you where I can see you, Seo-Jin replied, standing slowly. He walked around the desk, his presence expanding until the air in the room felt thin. He stopped just inches from her, close enough for her to feel the radiated heat of his body, yet the emotional distance between them was an abyss. The world thinks you are discarded. As my assistant, you will be the shadow that reminds them why they fear me. You will work off every cent I spent to pull you out of the gutter Min Hyuk left you in. Seo-Rin looked at the terms. It was a golden cage. She would be by his side 14 hours a day, privy to the dark inner workings of the Syndicate, yet treated as a stranger. It was a psychological torment to be so close to the man she once called husband, only to be addressed as a subordinate. And if I refuse? Seo-Jin leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, sending a shiver of pure terror and unwanted longing down her spine. Then you find out what happens when the rival you chose comes to collect the rest of what you owe him. I am the only shield you have left, Seo-Rin. Sign it or walk out into the dark. With a shaking hand, Seo-Rin picked up the pen. She wasn't just signing away her freedom. She was entering a lion's den where the lion wore the face of the man she had betrayed. As the ink dried, Seo-Jin took the folder back, his expression remaining an unreadable mask of stone. "Report at 5:00 a.m., he said, turning his back to her. "And Seo-Rin, don't mistake my proximity for mercy." The grand crystal ballroom hummed with the predatory energy of Seoul's elite. It had been weeks since Han Seo-Rin had been discarded by the Kang Syndicate, and the vultures were eager to see her remains. Rumors had painted her as a woman living in the gutter, stripped of her titles and her dignity. But when the heavy mahogany doors swung open, the whispers died a sudden, violent death. Seo-Rin stepped into the light, not as a beggar, but as a vision of cold, midnight elegance. She wore a gown of deep charcoal silk that clung to her frame like a second skin, its hem shimmering with hand-stitched obsidian crystals that caught the light with every measured step. It was a masterpiece of restraint and power, a dress that didn't just demand attention, it commanded submission. In her hand, she clutched a small, velvet-lined note that had been delivered to her cramped apartment only hours before. It bore no signature, only the sharp, authoritative calligraphy she knew all too well. "Wear this. Do not embarrass the name you still carry." Seo-Jin had chosen it. Even in his silence, he was still directing the play. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, some envious, some confused, but most of them terrified. They looked for the broken woman the tabloids had promised, but they found a queen who looked as though she had just stepped off a throne. Her head was held high, her spine a rigid line of defiance. If Seo-Jin wanted her to be his silent representative in this den of snakes, she would play the part with lethal precision. "Seo-Rin, is that actually you?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Choi, a woman who had been the first to delete Seo-Rin's number the morning after the unthinkable walk-away. Her eyes scanned the expensive silk with a mixture of greed and suspicion. "I heard you were," struggling. "This dress must have cost a fortune. Who is paying your bills these days?" The surrounding circle of socialites leaned in, their smiles sharp as glass. Seo-Rin didn't flinch. She took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her movements fluid and calm. "A woman's value isn't determined by her bank account, Mrs. Choi, but since you're curious, this dress wasn't bought, it was commissioned." She let the implication hang in the air. In this world, you didn't commission a gown like this unless you had the backing of a titan. As she moved through the crowd, she felt a familiar prickle on the back of her neck. Across the crowded ballroom, standing in the shadows of the mezzanine, was a silhouette she would know anywhere. Kang Seo-Jin stood with a glass in hand, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply watched her navigate the minefield he had set for her. He had thrown her to the wolves, but he had given her the armor to survive them. For the first time, Seo-Rin realized that his walking away wasn't an end, it was a test. And as she caught his gaze across the room, she knew she was finally learning how to pass it. The chandelier light in the grand Seoul ballroom felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Seo-Rin adjusted the cuff of her silk dress, the fabric a gift from Seo-Jin that felt more like armor than silk. She had spent weeks in the shadows, hearing the whispers of her disgrace, and the mercy Seo-Jin had shown by not ending her life. Tonight, she wasn't here to hide. She was here to work. "Well, look who decided to crawl out from under her rock." A sharp, melodic voice cut through the air. Seo-Rin didn't need to turn to recognize Minna, the daughter of a logistics tycoon, and a woman who had once begged to be invited to Seo-Rin's tea parties. Now, Minna stood with 3 other women, their champagne glasses held like weapons. "I heard Seo-Jin stripped your title," Minna continued, stepping closer, her eyes scanning Seo-Rin for any sign of poverty. "I'm surprised the security let a commoner into a gala of this caliber. Or did you sneak in through the kitchen? I hear you've become quite familiar with the service entrance lately." The other women giggled, a cruel, practiced sound. Seo-Rin kept her spine straight, her face a mask of calm. "I am here on business, Minna, something you wouldn't understand, as your only job is breathing your father's air." The laughter stopped instantly. Minna's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Business? You're a discarded wife, a woman caught with her husband's enemy. In our world, you're a ghost. You're lucky he let you live, but don't think for a second you're still one of us." "I never was one of you," Seo-Rin said quietly, stepping into Minna's personal space. "I was always above you, and even standing in the dirt, I still am." Minna's hand moved faster than the eye could follow. Crack. The sound of the slap echoed against the marble walls, drawing the attention of every power player in the room. Seo-Rin's head snapped to the side, her cheek blooming with heat and pain. The ballroom fell into a suffocating silence. Minna smirked, leaning in to whisper, "That was for the years I had to bow to you. Now, get out before I have the help throw you out." Seo-Rin didn't cry. She didn't even touch her face. She slowly turned her head back, her eyes landing on Minna with a terrifying, cold clarity. It was the same look Seo-Jin gave his enemies before he dismantled them. "Is that all you have?" Seo-Rin asked, her voice steady and echoing in the silence. "Because if you're going to strike the wife of Kang Seo-Jin, you'd better make sure you kill her. Otherwise, you've just signed your father's bankruptcy papers." As Minna's smirk began to falter, Seo-Rin caught a movement in the balcony above. There, shrouded in the shadows of the VIP lounge, stood Seo-Jin. He was watching. He didn't move to help, didn't call out, but for the first time since that night in the hotel, his eyes weren't filled with indifference. They were burning. The gala was a sea of false smiles and hidden daggers. A world hand Seo-Rin had once navigated with ease, but now felt like an intruder in. As she moved through the crowd, she felt the heavy weight of eyes on her, some mocking, some predatory. Seo-Jin was nowhere to be seen, having disappeared into a private lounge for business, leaving her to fend for herself in the shark tank he had created. "I heard the Kang Syndicate is having a clearance sale." A greasy voice chuckled behind her. Seo-Rin turned to find Mr. Park, a mid-level logistics mogul known more for his loud mouth than his business acumen. He stepped into her personal space, smelling of expensive cognac and cheap intentions. "First, Seo-Jin walks away from your little hotel tryst, and now he lets you wander around here like a stray cat. Tell me, Seo-Rin, is the Ice King finally thawing, or has he just realized you aren't worth the effort of a divorce?" Seo-Rin straightened her spine, her voice low and steady. "My husband's business is his own, Mr. Park. I'd suggest you focus on yours before it disappears." The man barked a laugh, loud enough to draw a small crowd. My business is thriving. Yours, however, is a joke. You're a discarded trophy, Seo-Rin. Everyone knows it. Why don't you come over to my table? I've always wanted to see what a Mafia boss's leftovers taste like." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The surrounding guests whispered behind their fans, waiting for her to break. Seo-Rin's hands trembled, but she refused to give them the satisfaction. Suddenly, the room went unnervingly quiet. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as a shadow fell over Mr. Park. "Leftovers." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. Kang Seo-Jin stood there, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. "Seo-Jin, I was just joking with a lady," Park stammered, his face draining of color. Seo-Jin stepped forward, closing the distance until he was inches from Park's face. He reached out, slowly adjusting the man's silk tie with terrifying precision. "You speak of my wife as if she is a commodity. That is a mistake." "It was a joke, please." Seo-Jin pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "In 30 seconds, your shipping contracts at the Incheon port will be voided. In 1 minute, your creditors will receive word that your assets are no longer backed by the Kang Syndicate. And by tomorrow morning, you will be a memory in this city." "You can't do that, it's just a few words," Park gasped. Seo-Jin leaned in closer, his voice audible only to Park and Seo-Rin. "My silence wasn't weakness, it was a grace period, and you just ended it." With a single tap on his screen, Seo-Jin turned his back on the man. Within seconds, Park's phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket, the first of many calls that would signal his ruin. Seo-Jin looked at Seo-Rin, his eyes momentarily searching hers before reverting to stone. He didn't offer his hand. He simply began to walk away, his voice trailing back to her. "Don't let the trash talk back to you, Seo-Rin. It wastes time." He was protecting her. But as she watched Mr. Park collapse into a chair, Seo-Rin realized the protection was just as cold as the betrayal. Rain lashed against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned shipping yard, the sound like 1,000 drum beats drowning out Seo-Rin's uneven breaths. She clutched her coat tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was supposed to meet a courier here, someone who promised evidence that could finally clear her name in the eyes of the man who had walked away from her. But as the heavy iron door groaned, shut behind her, the silence that followed was far more terrifying than the storm. "You always were a little too desperate for his approval, Seo-Rin," a voice drawled from the shadows. Min Hyuk stepped into the flickering light of a single overhead bulb, his designer suit a sharp contrast to the grime of the warehouse. Behind him, 4 men emerged, their silhouettes heavy with the presence of concealed weapons. Seo-Rin backed away, her heels clicking sharply on the oil-stained concrete. "The meeting was a setup. You're the one who sent the message." "I needed to see if you were still under his protection," Min Hyuk said, circling her like a predator. Seo-Jin made a show of walking away, but the underworld is whispering. They say he's burning his own assets, cutting ties with everyone who looked at you that night. Is it revenge, or is he just cleaning house before he discards the trash? "Whatever his reasons are, they have nothing to do with you," she snapped, though her hands trembled. Min Hyuk laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "It has everything to do with me. If he won't kill you for your betrayal, then I'll use you to make him crawl. A wife is a liability, Seo-Rin. And you're the perfect bait to see if that ice in his veins can finally be made to boil." He gestured to his men. 2 of them lunged forward. Seo-Rin didn't scream. She had learned long ago that in Seo-Jin's world, screams were a sign of defeat. She swung her heavy handbag, catching the first man across the temple, and tried to bolt for the side exit. She almost made it. A hand gripped her hair, jerking her backward with a violent snap. She gasped as she was slammed against a rusted support beam. Min Hyuk leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive tobacco and malice. "Let's see how long it takes for the great Kang Seo-Jin to realize his discarded queen is missing," he whispered, pulling a roll of duct tape from his pocket. "Or if he'll just keep walking until there's nothing left of you to find." As the darkness of a sedative-soaked rag pressed against her face, Seo-Rin's last thought wasn't of fear. It was a desperate, silent plea directed at the man who had left her in the silence. "Please, don't let the last thing I remember be your back turned to me." The heavy silence of the Kang estate felt different tonight. Usually, it was a wall designed to keep Han Seo-Rin out, but as she entered the private study to return the files Seo-Jin had left behind, the air felt thick with a secret, unspoken history. She found him sitting by the window, his back to her. He had discarded his suit jacket and unbuttoned his silk shirt, which hung loosely off one shoulder. In the dim, amber glow of the desk lamp, she saw it. Across his shoulder blade was a jagged, silver streak of raised flesh, a scar that didn't match the surgical precision of his life. It was a violent, ugly mark that looked like it belonged to a different man. Seo-Rin gasped softly, the sound catching in her throat. Seo-Jin stiffened, pulling his shirt back over his shoulder with a cold, mechanical grace. He didn't turn around. "You should have knocked, Seo-Rin." "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped closer, the image of the wound burned into her mind. It was old, weathered by time, but the jagged edges told a story of a narrow escape. He let out a short, hollow laugh that lacked any humor. "It's a souvenir, from a night you've spent 3 years trying to forget." Seo-Rin frowned, her mind racing through memories of galas, boardrooms, and silent dinners. "I don't understand." Finally, Seo-Jin turned, his dark eyes searching hers with a sudden, piercing intensity. "The night of the warehouse fire at the docks, you were told it was an electrical accident, that you were rescued by the fire department before the roof collapsed." He took a slow step toward her, his presence looming like a shadow. "The fire department didn't get there for 20 minutes, Seo-Rin. The roof didn't just collapse, it was blown, and I wasn't waiting outside with the paramedics." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She remembered the heat, the smoke, and the feeling of strong arms wrapping around her just as the world turned black. She had always believed the official report her father had given her. "You," she breathed, her hand instinctively reaching out toward his shoulder before she pulled it back. "You went back in for me, before we were even married." "I was the one who pulled you out," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And I took a falling beam to the back so you wouldn't have a single scratch on yours. I've been bleeding for you since long before you decided to betray me with Min Hyuk." Seo-Rin felt the floor tilt beneath her. The man she thought was indifferent, the man she believed had only married her for a strategic alliance, had carried the physical weight of her life on his skin for years. The scar wasn't just a wound. It was a silent confession of a devotion she had been too blind to see. As he walked past her, leaving her alone in the dark room, the unthinkable silence of his walk-away earlier that week finally began to make sense. It wasn't the silence of a man who didn't care. It was the silence of a man who had already given everything and had nothing left to say. The cold dust of the Syndicate's archives felt like a shroud as Seo-Rin sifted through the discarded logs of the night that had ruined her life. For weeks, she had carried the weight of her own shame, her memory of that evening a blurred, sickening haze that Seo-Jin had interpreted as guilt. But as she opened a mislabeled security file from the hotel's private lounge, the blood in her veins turned to ice. It wasn't just a video, it was a digital receipt for a soul. In the grainy, low-light footage, she saw herself sitting at the bar, waiting for the dinner meeting that was supposed to save her family's business. She looked poised, elegant, the perfect wife of the Kang Empire. Then she saw the waiter, a man she now recognized as one of the rival's low-level enforcers, swap her glass of sparkling water. Within minutes, the transformation was terrifying. The Seo-Rin on screen began to sway, her eyes losing focus, her head lulling in a way that looked nothing like passion and everything like a medical emergency. When the rival, Min Hyuk, walked in, he didn't embrace a lover. He caught a collapsing body. He posed her, draped her limp arm over his shoulder, and whispered into her ear while looking directly at the hidden camera with a triumphant, predatory grin. He wasn't winning her heart. He was staging a crime scene. Seo-Rin's breath hitched, a sob of pure, jagged relief and fury catching in her throat. She wasn't a traitor. She hadn't broken the one vow that gave her life meaning. She watched as the footage showed Min Hyuk dragging her toward the elevator, her heels scraping the floor, a detail the eyewitnesses had conveniently failed to mention to Seo-Jin. She clutched the tablet to her chest, her knuckles white. All this time, she had accepted Seo-Jin's coldness as a penance she deserved. She had let him walk away in that hotel room because she had been too drugged to defend herself and too confused to remember the truth. The unthinkable silence he had maintained wasn't just a punishment for her. It was a trap set by an enemy who knew exactly how to weaponize Seo-Jin's pride against him. She stood up, the shadows of the archive room no longer feeling like a cage but a launching pad. The evidence was in her hands, but the psychological scars remained. Seo-Jin had dismantled his world because he believed she had dismantled their love. Now, she had the key to stop the collapse, but as she looked at the door, a chilling thought struck her. In the world of the Korean Mafia, the truth didn't always set you free. Sometimes, it just made the target on your back even larger. She had to get to Seo-Jin before the rival finished what he started. But for the first time in months, Han Seo-Rin wasn't running from the truth. She was hunting with it. The silence in the study was heavy, saturated with the scent of sandalwood and the unspoken ghosts of their marriage. Seo-Jin stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, jagged line against the sprawling Seoul skyline. He didn't turn when Seo-Rin entered. He didn't even acknowledge the soft click of the door closing behind her. "Seo-Jin," she began, her voice barely a whisper, yet it felt like a shout in the stillness. "That night, at the hotel, it wasn't what you saw, it wasn't what you think." He finally moved, but only to swirl the amber liquid in his glass. The ice clinked, a cold, rhythmic sound that mimicked the steady beat of a heart that had long ago learned to survive on frost. "The eyes are the most reliable witnesses I own, Seo-Rin," he said, his tone devoid of heat. "They saw you in his room. They saw the disarray. They saw the betrayal I always suspected was hiding behind your quiet smiles." "I was drugged," she blurted out, the words tumbling over one another in a rush of desperation. She stepped into the light, her hands trembling as she clutched a small, crumpled slip of paper, a lab report she had risked everything to obtain. Min Hyuk didn't want me. He wanted you destroyed. He used me as the detonator. I woke up in that room with no memory of how I got there, only the sound of your footsteps walking away. Seo-Jin finally turned. His gaze was a clinical sweep, analyzing her face for the flicker of a lie. He walked toward her, each step measured and predatory, until he stood close enough for her to feel the cold aura radiating from his suit. He took the paper from her hand, his gloved fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric second, before he set it down on the desk without even looking at it. "A convenient story," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "The drugged wife is a classic play in our world, Seo-Rin. It shifts the burden of guilt while maintaining the status of the victim. Look at the report, Seo-Jin. Look at the dates." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying gentleness. It wasn't an act of affection. It was a reminder of his ownership. "I walked away that night because a king does not bargain for leftovers," he whispered, his eyes dark with a hidden, agonizing conflict. "If you want me to believe you, don't bring me papers. Bring me the head of the man who supposedly set this stage. Until then, you are exactly what the world thinks you are. A woman who lost her crown because she couldn't keep her loyalty." He stepped back, the warmth of his proximity vanishing instantly. "Go back to your room, Seo-Rin. The silence suited you better." As she watched him turn his back on her again, Seo-Rin realized that the truth wasn't enough to melt the ice. To win him back, she would have to become as ruthless as the man who had discarded her. The porcelain cup rattled against the saucer, a tiny metallic chime that felt like a death knell in the oppressive silence of the Kang estate. Seo-Rin's hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the patriarch's private study. Since Seo-Jin had walked away from her that night in the penthouse, the air in the mansion had grown frigid, thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. She was a ghost in her own home, ignored by the guards and avoided by the staff, yet she still moved with the quiet grace of a woman who had once been the heart of this empire. "Father," she murmured, stepping into the room. The elder Kang sat by the window, his silhouette sharp against the gray Seoul skyline. He was the only one who hadn't looked at her with pity or disgust since the scandal broke. To him, she was still the daughter-in-law he had chosen for her steel-trap mind. He gestured for her to set the tray down. "You still brew it the old way," the old man wheezed, his voice a dry rasp. "Seo-Jin has no patience for the leaves to steep. He wants everything done before the water even boils." "Patience is the only thing I have left, father," Seo-Rin replied softly. As the elder reached for the cup, a flicker of movement caught Seo-Rin's eye, a shadow in the hallway that didn't belong to any of the regular detail. The fragrance of the tea hit her then. It wasn't the earthy, bitter notes of the pu'er she had selected. There was a faint, cloying sweetness underneath, like crushed almonds. Her breath hitched, cyanide. "Don't," she cried, her hand shooting out to slap the cup from his grip just as the rim touched his lips. The porcelain shattered against the mahogany floor, the dark liquid seeping into the grain like a spreading bruise. The elder Kang froze, his eyes widening with a mix of confusion and sudden, sharp terror. Outside the door, the shadow vanished. "Seo-Rin, what have you?" Before he could finish, the doors swung open. Seo-Jin stood there, his coat damp from the rain, his eyes like flint. He looked from the shattered porcelain to his father's trembling hands, and then finally to Seo-Rin. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. "I saw someone," Seo-Rin gasped, her voice trembling. "The tea, it smelled wrong. Someone is trying to kill him." Seo-Jin stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't look for the assassin. He didn't call for the guards. He simply looked at the wreckage on the floor and then back at the wife he no longer trusted. "The servants say you were the only one in the kitchen, Seo-Rin," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "First you give yourself to my rival, and now you give my father poison." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The unthinkable walk-away hadn't just been a strategic retreat. It had been the start of a game where she was the only piece left on the board, and every move she made now looked like a betrayal. The trap wasn't just set, it had snapped shut. The tea was a delicate blend of jasmine and gold, a peace offering from Seo-Rin to the patriarch of the Kang Syndicate. She had brewed it with trembling hands, hoping it would be the first thread in mending the tapestry of a family torn apart by silence. But as the elder Kang's fingers curled around the porcelain, his eyes suddenly rolled back, and the cup shattered against the marble floor. Within seconds, the serene garden was swarming with black-suited guards. Seo-Jin appeared like a shadow, his presence cold enough to freeze the humid Seoul air. He didn't rush to his father's side. He looked directly at Seo-Rin. "I didn't do this," she whispered, the words dying in her throat as a guard stepped forward, holding up her silk clutch. Inside, tucked behind a photograph of her and Seo-Jin from better days, was a small, empty glass vial. "The toxin is rare, boss," the head of security reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "Traced to the black markets in Busan, the same markets Min Hyuk's family controls." Seo-Rin felt the world tilt. The evidence was surgical in its precision. Financial records appeared on a tablet, leaked offshore accounts in her name, receiving millions from the rival syndicate. Photos followed, grainy shots of her meeting a courier in an alleyway she didn't recognize, during an hour she thought she had spent alone in the library. "Look at me, Seo-Jin," she pleaded, stepping toward him. The guards blocked her path, their hands on their holsters. "It's a setup. You know I would never touch your father. He's the only one who showed me mercy when you wouldn't." Seo-Jin remained a statue of obsidian. He picked up the empty vial from the silk bag, turning it over in his gloved hand. The unthinkable silence was back, heavier and more suffocating than before. To the rest of the syndicate, the story was clear. The scorned wife had finally struck back, choosing her lover's side over her husband's legacy. "Take her to the holding cell," Seo-Jin finally commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "Seo-Jin, please," she cried out as they gripped her arms. "Min Hyuk is doing this to destroy us both. Don't let him win." As they dragged her away, she looked back one last time. Seo-Jin wasn't looking at the evidence or his ailing father. He was staring at the shattered porcelain on the floor, his face an unreadable mask of grief and calculation. For the first time, Seo-Rin realized that the frame job wasn't just meant to kill the patriarch. It was designed to make Seo-Jin the one who would have to pull the trigger on his own wife. The trap was closed, and the only person who could save her was the man who had every reason to hate her. The silence in the study was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the lingering chill of betrayal. Kang Seo-Jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the neon veins of Seoul pulsing below him, but his eyes were fixed on the reflection of the woman sitting on the velvet sofa behind him. Han Seo-Rin looked smaller than he had ever seen her, pale, trembling, and shadowed by the weight of a crime she swore she hadn't committed. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking like a funeral bell. "The evidence is absolute, Seo-Rin," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The poison in my father's tea, the encrypted messages to the rival syndicate. It all leads back to your phone, to your hands." "I didn't do it, Seo-Jin," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have never lied to you about my loyalty, even when you walked away from me. Please just look at me." Seo-Jin didn't turn. He couldn't. If he looked into those eyes, the same eyes he had protected from the shadows for years, his resolve would shatter. He had spent his life building an empire on logic and cold strategy, yet here he was, paralyzed by a woman who had been found at the center of every disaster striking his family. "They say a boss who lets his heart rule his head is a boss who invites a coup," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "My men are calling for blood. They want an execution to restore the honor you supposedly tarnished." Seo-Rin stood up, her footsteps silent on the rug. She stopped just inches from his back, not daring to touch him. "Is that what you want, my blood?" Seo-Jin finally turned, his face a mask of iron. The distance between them felt like an ocean. "No, I've done the unthinkable once before and I will do it again. I won't kill you, Seo-Rin, but I cannot keep a traitor in my house." He pulled a single, one-way ticket from his breast pocket and laid it on the mahogany desk. It was a ticket to a secluded estate in the northern mountains, a gilded cage where she would be stripped of her name, her status, and her connection to him forever. "The car is waiting," he said, his gaze dropping to her hand, which instinctively hovered over her stomach. He felt a pang of agony he refused to acknowledge. "By dawn, you will no longer be the wife of the Kang Syndicate. You will be a ghost." "You're sending me away while the real traitor is still in this room?" she asked, a spark of her old fire returning through the tears. "I am saving your life from my own men," he snapped, his grip tightening on his glass until it threatened to shatter. "Go, before I change my mind and let the law of the underworld take its course." As she turned to leave, her head bowed in final, crushing defeat, Seo-Jin watched her go. He told himself this was his final move to protect the Empire. He didn't realize that by exiling her, he was finally letting the real enemy inside the gates. The neon reflection of the Seoul skyline bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rival's penthouse, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Han Seo-Rin stood pressed against the cold marble pillar, her breath shallow and jagged. She had come here seeking a way to clear her name, but what she found was a truth far more lethal than her own supposed betrayal. Min Hyuk, the man who had tried to dismantle her life, sat relaxed in a velvet armchair, a smirk playing on his lips. But it wasn't the sight of the rival that made Seo-Rin's blood turn to ice. It was the man standing across from him, the man who currently held a glass of expensive scotch and laughed with the ease of an old friend. It was Secretary Park. Park had been at Seo-Jin's side for 15 years. He was the shadow that followed the king, the gatekeeper of the Kang Syndicate secrets, and the man who had found the evidence that framed Seo-Rin. "The Ice King is finally melting," Park said, his voice devoid of the subservient tone he used at the office. Walking away from Seo-Rin was the first crack. He's liquidating assets, pulling back security. He thinks he's playing a long game to protect her, but he's actually handing us the keys to the city. Min Hyuk chuckled, swirling his drink. "And the wife? Seo-Jin still thinks she's the one who betrayed him. Your little setup at the hotel was a masterpiece, Park. He's so blinded by his own code of loyalty that he can't see the real snake in his garden." Seo-Rin felt a nauseating wave of realization. Every cold look from Seo-Jin, every moment of isolation she had endured over the past weeks, had been engineered by the man Seo-Jin trusted most. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling as she gripped her phone, hitting the record button. She needed proof. If she died tonight, the truth had to survive. "Once we take the shipping docks tomorrow night," Park continued, his eyes hardening, "Seo-Jin will be a king with no kingdom. And as for Seo-Rin, she's served her purpose as a distraction. You can dispose of her whenever you like." A floorboard groaned under Seo-Rin's weight as she tried to shift for a better angle. The sound was microscopic, but in a room filled with predators, it was a gunshot. Secretary Park's head snapped toward the pillar. The mask of the loyal assistant vanished, replaced by the hollow gaze of a killer. "Who's there?" Seo-Rin didn't wait. She bolted for the service exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't just have to save herself anymore. She had to warn the man who had walked away from her before the shadow at his side finished what the rival had started. For the first time, she wasn't running from the Mafia boss, she was running to save him. The salty air of the Incheon docks bit into Han Seo-Rin's skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold metal of the handcuffs chafing her wrists. She stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps as Min Hyuk hauled her toward the edge of a rusting shipping container. The weight of her pregnancy made every step a grueling battle, a constant reminder of the life flickering inside her, the only part of Seo-Jin she had left. "Slow down," Min Hyuk sneered, his fingers digging into her shoulder with a cruelty he no longer bothered to hide. "We wouldn't want the little heir to get bruised before the big show, would we?" Seo-Rin looked at him, her eyes burning with a defiance that hadn't been there months ago. She was no longer the fragile wife who mistook silence for weakness. "He will kill you for this," she rasped, her voice steady despite the trembling of her knees. "You think you've caught me, but you've only guaranteed your own end." Min Hyuk laughed, a hollow, desperate sound that echoed against the metal walls of the shipyard. "Seo-Jin walked away from you once, remember? He handed you to me like a piece of unwanted trash. What makes you think he'll come back for the wreckage now?" He shoved her down onto a wooden crate. The smell of diesel and rotting fish was overwhelming. Below them, the black water of the Yellow Sea churned against the pylons, hungry and indifferent. Min Hyuk pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his jagged, anxious features. He hit a contact and held the phone up so Seo-Rin could see the name on the screen, the Ice King. "He's been dismantling his own empire to clear a path," Min Hyuk muttered, more to himself than to her. "He thinks he's playing a long game, but he forgot that a king without a kingdom is just a target." The call connected. There was no greeting on the other end, only a heavy, weighted silence that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air. Even through the speaker, Seo-Jin's presence was a suffocating force. "I have her, Seo-Jin," Min Hyuk shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his fatting bravado. "The docks, Pier 7. You have 30 minutes to transfer the shipping codes and the warehouse titles to my name, or the mother of your child goes into the water." Seo-Rin held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, Seo-Jin's voice drifted through the line, calm, low, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You've made a mistake, Min Hyuk. I didn't walk away to give her to you. I walked away so I could see every single person who dared to touch her." The line went dead. Min Hyuk stared at the phone, a flicker of genuine terror crossing his face. He looked at Seo-Rin, then at the dark horizon. The silence of the docks had changed. It was no longer empty. It was a predator holding its breath. The wind howled through the skeletal frame of the abandoned shipyard, carrying the scent of salt and rusted iron. Han Seo-Rin sat zip-tied to a bolted chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every time she moved, the cold steel of the rival's gun barrel pressed harder against her temple. Min Hyuk leaned against a shipping container, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. 5 minutes, Seo-Rin," he whispered, his voice jagged with desperate triumph. 5 minutes until the mighty Kang Seo-Jin proves what everyone already knows, that he's a cold-blooded snake who would never trade a single one of his empire for a woman he already threw away. Seo-Rin closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. She didn't pray for rescue. She prayed that Seo-Jin would stay away. She knew the weight of the Kang Syndicate. It wasn't just money, it was thousands of lives, a legacy of blood, and the only shield Seo-Jin had against the wolves at his heels. Suddenly, the phone in Min Hyuk's hand vibrated. He put it on speaker, his grin widening. "The location is set, Seo-Jin," Min Hyuk shouted into the receiver. "Do you have the decryption keys for the offshore accounts and the signed dissolution of the syndicate? Or should I let the world see what happens to your discarded queen?" There was a long, suffocating silence. The only sound was the distant crashing of waves. Then, Seo-Jin's voice broke through the static. It was terrifyingly calm, the same tone he had used the night he walked away from the hotel room. "You think this is a negotiation, Min Hyuk? I think I have the only thing in the world you ever actually loved," the rival spat. "The syndicate for her life, 1 hour. If the transfers aren't complete, she goes into the harbor." "You're wrong about one thing," Seo-Jin replied, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a quiet, lethal menace. "I didn't walk away from her because I stopped loving her. I walked away because I needed to see exactly which hand would reach out to hurt her so I could cut it off." Seo-Rin's heart hammered against her ribs. "The papers are signed," Seo-Jin continued. "The empire is yours, but understand this, you aren't inheriting a throne, you're inheriting a grave. I'm coming for my wife, and I'm not bringing a pen, I'm bringing the unthinkable." The line went dead. Min Hyuk's hand trembled slightly as he looked at the screen. For the first time, the triumph in his eyes flickered with a shadow of doubt. He had the ransom, but he finally realized that the man who had just traded an empire for a woman was far more dangerous than the man who ruled it. Rain lashed against the rusted corrugated metal of the shipyard warehouse, the sound like 1,000 drumbeats masking the terrified breathing of Han Seo-Rin. She was bound to a wooden chair, her eyes wide as she looked at Min Hyuk. The rival boss stood over her, his fingers tracing the edge of a jagged blade. Around them stood 30 armed men, their weapons trained on the only entrance. "He won't come, Seo-Rin," Min Hyuk sneered, checking his watch. "I sent the message. I told him the price for your life was his empire. I told him to sign over the Syndicate's ports or watch you bleed. And what did the great Kang Seo-Jin do? He went silent, just like the night he walked away from you at the hotel." Seo-Rin's heart felt like it was breaking in her chest, not from fear of the blade, but from the crushing weight of the truth. She had been a fool to think she mattered more than his crown. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned. The sound of a single pair of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. One man walked through the threshold. No guards, no backup, no weapons in his hands. Kang Seo-Jin looked exactly as he did the night of the betrayal, impeccable in a charcoal suit, his expression a mask of terrifying calm. He stopped 20 feet away, his eyes locking onto Seo-Rin's bruised face. For a split second, the ice in his gaze cracked, revealing a raw, jagged agony. "Drop the knife, Min Hyuk," Seo-Jin said, his voice low and vibrating with a menace that made the armed guards visibly flinch. "The papers first, Seo-Jin," Min Hyuk shouted, pressing the blade against Seo-Rin's throat. "Sign them or she dies." Seo-Jin pulled a thick envelope from his inner pocket and tossed it onto the oil-stained floor. "It's all there. The ports, the shell companies, the keys to the vaults. I've signed it all away. I'm no longer the head of the Kang Syndicate. I'm just a man." Min Hyuk let out a manic laugh. "You're a fool. You gave up everything for a woman who cheated on you." "She didn't cheat," Seo-Jin said, stepping forward. "I knew the truth before I even walked out of that hotel room. I walked away to draw the traitors out of my own house. And I'm walking away from my power now because a throne is worthless if she isn't sitting beside me." As Min Hyuk reached for the papers, distracted by his greed, Seo-Jin's hand moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He didn't need an army. The unthinkable truth was that Seo-Jin was the Syndicate's most lethal weapon. In one fluid motion, he snatched a hidden ceramic blade from his sleeve. The warehouse erupted. The silence was over. The bloodbath had begun. The warehouse smelled of rusted iron and salt air, the heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic, frantic ticking of the device strapped to Seo-Rin's chest. She sat bound to a steel chair, her eyes wide and stinging with tears as she looked at Seo-Jin. He stood 10 feet away, motionless, his face a mask of stone that betrayed nothing of the war raging behind his eyes. Between them stood Min Hyuk, holding a sleek black remote in one hand and a heavy, silver-plated detonator in the other. He was laughing, a jagged, desperate sound. "You walked away once, Seo-Jin. Everyone saw it. You gave her up to save your pride," Min Hyuk spat, his thumb hovering over the red button of the detonator. "Now let's see what you'll do when the cost is your empire. This detonator is linked to the foundations of your central headquarters. Press it, and you save the girl, but you watch your legacy turn to ash in 10 seconds. Or walk away again. Keep your power and let the woman who betrayed you burn." Seo-Rin tried to speak, but the heavy tape across her mouth muffled her plea into a broken hum. She wanted to tell him to go. She had spent years believing she was just a piece of his property, a political asset he would discard the moment the numbers didn't add up. She didn't want him to lose everything for a wife he had once turned his back on. Seo-Jin took a single step forward. The red digital numbers on Seo-Rin's chest were blurring. 00, 15, 00, 14. "You think my power comes from those buildings?" Seo-Jin's voice was a low, terrifying growl that vibrated in the hollow space. He didn't look at the rival. He didn't look at the detonator. His eyes were locked on Seo-Rin, searching for the truth they had both hidden for so long. "I walked away that night to draw the traitors out of the shadows," he said, his voice softening only for her. "I didn't do it because you were expendable. I did it because I couldn't destroy them while you were standing in the crossfire." 10 seconds, Seo-Jin," Min Hyuk screamed, his face contorted. "Choose the Empire or the girl." 00, 07, 00, 06. In one fluid motion, Seo-Jin reached into his coat. Min Hyuk flinched, expecting a gun, but Seo-Jin pulled out his own phone and tapped a single command. Far across the city, the silent alarms of the Kang headquarters deactivated. He He wasn't saving the buildings. He was letting them go. He lunged forward, not for the rival, but for Seo-Rin. He grabbed the silver detonator from Min Hyuk's hand with a bone-snapping twist of the wrist and smashed it into the concrete floor. "The Empire can be rebuilt," Seo-Jin whispered, shielding her body with his own as the timer hit 0. "But there is only one of you." The blast from the distant headquarters shook the ground beneath them, a low rumble of falling giants, but in the warehouse, there was only the sound of Seo-Jin's heartbeat against her ear. He had chosen the unthinkable. He had chosen love over the crown. The warehouse smelled of salt air and ozone, the silence following the explosion of gunfire heavier than the noise itself. Min Hyuk lay crumpled near the edge of the pier, his grand ambitions bleeding out into the cold concrete. He had tried to play a game of shadows with the King of Seoul, only to realize too late that Kang Seo-Jin was the shadow itself. Seo-Jin didn't look at his fallen rival. His eyes were fixed entirely on Seo-Rin. He moved toward her, his pace steady, the lethal coldness that had defined him for years finally beginning to thaw at the edges. With a flick of his knife, he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, Seo-Rin didn't collapse. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with a clarity he had never seen during their years of distant, polite marriage. "You walked away," she whispered, her voice trembling but her spirit unbroken. "That night in the hotel, everyone thought you gave up. I thought you gave up." Seo-Jin reached out, his thumb tracing the faint bruise on her cheek left by the rival's hands. "I had to walk away from the woman you were being forced to be," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "I had to let the world believe I was weak so I could see who was truly loyal. But I never left you, Seo-Rin. I was simply clearing the path so you could finally see me." He held out his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. Seo-Rin looked at his palm, then at the burning wreckage of the life they once knew. The unthinkable act hadn't been an abandonment. It had been a surgical strike against their enemies and her own low self-esteem. She realized now that love in their world wasn't a soft thing. It was a fortress. She placed her hand in his, her fingers locking firmly with his. The emotional distance that had defined them was gone, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful unity. "The Syndicate is waiting," Seo-Jin said, turning her toward the line of black cars appearing on the horizon like a funeral procession for their enemies. "They think they're meeting their boss." Seo-Rin straightened her shoulders, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. "No," she corrected, her voice echoing with the authority of a woman who had found her power in the heart of the storm. "They're meeting their king and queen." Together, they walked out of the wreckage. Behind them lay the remains of a betrayal that had failed to break them. Ahead lay an empire that would finally learn what happens when a mafia boss stops walking away and starts standing his ground. The rebirth was complete. They weren't just survivors of a scandal. They were the new architecture of power in the city. The morning sun over Seoul didn't just rise. It surrendered to the glass and steel of the Kang Syndicate headquarters. Inside the top-floor office, the air was no longer thick with the suffocating scent of ozone and fear. Instead, it smelled of expensive sandalwood and the quiet, rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen. Han Seo-Rin sat behind the mahogany desk, her silhouette framed by the sprawling city she once thought would swallow her whole. She wasn't the woman who had cowered in a hotel suite, waiting for a husband's wrath. She wasn't the discarded wife the tabloids had mocked. As she signed the final merger document that effectively erased Min Hyuk's former assets from the map, her movements were precise, devoid of the trembling that had once defined her. The heavy double doors opened. No one knocked anymore. Only one person had the right to enter this sanctuary unannounced. Kang Seo-Jin walked in, his long coat sweeping behind him. He didn't head for his chair. He walked straight to her, stopping just close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. He leaned down, placing a hand on the back of her chair, his gaze lingering on the document she had just signed. "The rivals' territories are officially ours," she said, her voice steady, carrying a new, melodic authority. "The board of directors is waiting in the gala hall. They are expecting a speech from the man who walked away." Seo-Jin's lips curved into the ghost of a smile, a rare, dangerous expression that was now reserved only for her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his dark, piercing eyes. "Let them wait," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that commanded the room. "They didn't see what I saw. They thought I walked away because I was finished. They didn't realize I was simply making room for the person who actually belongs on this throne." Seo-Rin stood up, her silk gown whispering against the floor. She didn't look away from him. The Ice King hadn't melted. He had simply found his equal in the frost. She adjusted his tie, her fingers lingering against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. "Then let's go," she said, her eyes flashing with a shared, lethal understanding. "Let's show them what happens when the king and queen finally play on the same side." He offered his arm, and as they walked toward the doors together, the guards outside straightened, their heads bowing in unison. It wasn't a gesture of mere habit anymore. It was a recognition of power. The Empire was no longer just secured, it was reborn. And as the doors to the gala opened, revealing a room full of the most powerful people in the underworld, Han Seo-Rin didn't just walk into the light. She led the way. In the world of the Kang Syndicate, silence was the ultimate weapon, and loyalty was the ultimate reward. From a wife discarded in the shadows to the powerful queen standing beside the king of Seoul, Han Seo-Rin and Kang Seo-Jin have proven that true power isn't just about control. It's about who you trust when the world turns against you. If you were captivated by this journey of psychological tension and slow-burn redemption, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps other drama lovers find our stories. Which moment of Seo-Jin's Unthinkable revenge was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. If you want to see more high-stakes Korean Mafia stories where the underdog takes the throne, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Most importantly, turn on post notification so you're the first to witness our next epic tale of betrayal and power. Thank you for watching, and remember, in this game, the best move is the one they never see coming.